giving me wind and rain. You're some kind of butterfly. Baby, you give me midnight. You whip up my appetite. Don't leave me here high and dry. Oh, well, I don't wanna jinx it, baby, and twist myself at the spine. Don't wanna overthink it, baby. It's just twist your body and mine. Baby, you give me ice and fire. You're giving me wind and rain. You're some kind of butterfly. Baby, you give me midnight. You whip up my appetite. Don't leave me here high and dry. Oh,
Master for Frederick's reputation and for the future of Prussia itself. For there was another Prussia and another Frederick. Frederick the Great was also a self-styled philosopher king, an intellectual heavyweight, a talented musician, philosopher, historian, and poet. Frederick's Prussia was a beacon of enlightenment and culture, and his life unfolded as an epic drama of scandal, sacrifice, and glory. So how great was Frederick? And how did this enlightened monarch become an inspiration for the most repellent regime in modern European history? I want to rediscover Frederick the Great, to unravel the many lives of What we have to understand about Brandenburg is its place on the geopolitical map of Europe. Brandenburg was situated in a dangerous neighborhood. In the east was the vast Empire of Russia. In the north, Sweden, one of the most powerful protagonists in the 17th century. In the west, France. And in the south, the sprawling Empire of the Habsburgs, Austria. And sandy Brandenburg was in the no man's land between these major European powers. Deep in the bowels of Berlin Cathedral lie the bones of the Hohenzollern dynasty. This is the clan of Protestant noblemen that would lead the transformation of modest Brandenburg into a European power. By the close of the 17th century, they had acquired a collection of territories that stretched like an uneven line of stepping stones across Central Europe. This included, on its eastern frontier, the Duchy of Prussia, and after Frederick's grandfather was crowned king there, all Hohenzollern lands became known as Prussia. Yet the kingdom remained geopolitically exposed, and nobody felt this inherent vulnerability more acutely than Frederick William I. Nicknamed the Soldier King, he began to create a Prussian military machine. Good news for Prussia, bad news for his eldest son, the future Frederick the Great. Bonsoir. Je suis
Professor Dr.
Clark.
Clark.
Yes.
Riding on your own horse.
Yes, I've left my horse outside. I hope that's okay.
It's better so, yeah.
We're in the Charlottenburg Palace, built in 1701. And in the early part of the 18th century, this place became a major cultural center.
Like many of his forebears, Crown Prince Frederick loved painting, music, and literature, the arts of peace. But the cultured prince was a grave disappointment to his authoritarian father.
Frederick Wilhelm I, his father, wanted him to be a good soldier. He had to be on horseback, and he had to learn to shoot, and he had to learn discipline, and Frederick was not really interested as a young boy in military things at all. He started reading French books, and he tried to read Latin, and he was not allowed to because his father hated French books and he hated Latin, and he had to do this in the night.
By the age of 16, the Crown Prince was leading a double life. Outwardly, he conformed to a grueling regime imposed by his father. But in secret, he continued to pursue his artistic passions. This was no ordinary teenage rebellion. Frederick's rift with his father escalated into a vicious psychodrama.
Sensing that his son was drifting away from him, Frederick William became increasingly violent. He frequently cuffed, slapped, and humiliated the prince in public.
Frederick thought that his father hated him, and I think he was right. And in my opinion, he really, really hated his father.
This clash was nothing new in Hohenzollern family history, but never before had the struggle between father and son been waged with such emotional and psychological intensity.
In 1730, fearing a rift with Austria, the king blocked Frederick's proposed marriage to an English princess. For the 18-year-old prince, this was the final straw. He hatched a plan to run away to England to begin a new life in exile. An act of high treason that scandalized the courts of Europe. But the flight was a fiasco, and inevitably, Frederick was captured. The king was incandescent with rage, and here at Küstrin, the site of a mighty Prussian fortress, he had his own son thrown in jail.
Friedrich was here for 2 months, from September 5th, and he was in the prison without exit. And in this time, Friedrich himself expected his own execution.
Do you think the king would actually have executed his own son? Is that conceivable?
I'm quite sure.
But the king discovered that his son had an accomplice. Hans Hermann von Katte, a dashing young officer, had become the prince's closest friend. And it was Katte who would suffer the full force of the king's fury. Frederick's life would be spared.
Let's go to the spot where it must have been.
But the prince would be forced to witness the gruesome spectacle of his friend's execution.
The execution was public, but especially it was a performance for the Crown Prince, who was in the castle, and the window was high, and two servants had to hold Frederick, so he could see Katte passing the wall, and there this last dialogue took place. Prince, please, my dear Katte, forgive me what I do with you. And Katte replied in French, of course, my prince, I would like to do this for you 1,000 times. And then he fainted.
Within 3 years of Katte's death, resigned to his dynastic obligations as heir to the throne, Frederick reluctantly agreed to marry an Austrian-approved bride. But the trauma inflicted here at Küstrin would forever shape this future king's personal and political character.
This was a man who threw up defenses around himself. He became a highly artificial person, a man of artifice, not of deception, I don't think, but of dissimulation, a man who became accustomed to playing a role. He once said to an intimate friend that he felt he was a mirror that dared not be what nature made it, but was obliged always to reflect what was around it. And this appalling, traumatic experience also had political ramifications. It was the Austrians who had opposed the English marriage, and it was the Austrians who advised King Frederick William I of Prussia about the length of his son's imprisonment, and ultimately it was the Austrians who forced him to marry his wife. She was an Austrian candidate, someone who'd been chosen by the Austrian court.
It would be 7 years before Frederick could wreak his vengeance upon Austria, a period in which the Crown Prince would again astound the courts of Europe, this time as a radical writer, an intellectual heavyweight of the Age of Enlightenment.
The 18th century was an era of enlightened monarchs. Charles III, Leopold II of Tuscany, even to some extent Catherine of Russia. But none contributed to the Enlightenment as active cultural producers in the way that Frederick did. And I think what that tells us is something about the seriousness of the philosophical side of that curious double existence that Frederick led, the existence of a philosopher king.
Frederick's intellectual mentor was none other than the French philosopher Voltaire, the most celebrated mind of his age.
So, jetzt schauen wir uns den Anti-Machiavel an.
It was under Voltaire's direct tutelage that his royal apprentice wrote and published this, a provocative essay in which, with remarkable eloquence, the precocious young prince radically redefined the nature of kingship.
Well, this is extraordinary. I'm holding Frederick the Great's Anti-Machiavel, a treatise expressing his vision of a virtuous kingship in opposition to Machiavelli's Prince, an essay which stressed the importance of the quest for glory and riches. In contrast to that, Frederick sets out a vision of kingship which is about sustaining the welfare of the state, the happiness of one's subjects, and so on. And that's what I have in my hands here, the king's own manuscript, in tiny, beautiful handwriting. It's really quite a remarkable thing.
To gain the affection of the people and the great, it is necessary for a prince to be humane and gracious, to have a fund of probity and virtue, and to inspire confidence through wisdom.
The Anti-Machiavel was a groundbreaking work of political philosophy, a manifesto for all aspects of statecraft, including a blueprint for war. In May 1740, Frederick's father died. His son announced his new reign with a spectacular act of vengeance and daring. He unleashed war on the empire that had long overshadowed Prussia, intimidated his father, and inflicted such misery on Frederick himself. Habsburg, Austria.
In December 1740, just 7 months into his reign, Frederick amassed 27,000 troops on the banks of the river Oder. Their objective, to invade and conquer Silesia, the richest province of the Habsburg Empire. To the astonishment of all of Europe, the philosopher king was waging war.
Ich meine, hat auf einmal gespürt, dass Verantwortung nicht nur für sich trägt und für seine Familie, sondern auch für ganzes Land und für die Zukunft seiner Leute. Und Schlesien war das Kammergut damals von Europa. Und Friedrich hat's gepokert und hat's gewonnen. Ne?
The decision to launch an unprovoked strike on Silesia was taken by the king alone, against all the advice of his military and diplomatic aides. It was the single most important political act of Frederick's life. "I've crossed the Rubicon," Frederick declared, invoking the military exploits of none other than Julius Caesar.
Six weeks after crossing the river Oder, virtually all of rich Silesia, including the Catholic capital, Breslau, was in Prussian hands, and Frederick had no intention of letting go.
Over the next 5 years, Frederick fought and won 2 Silesian wars, changing forever the balance of power in Central Europe. Never will Austria get over the pain of Silesia's loss, the king later reflected. Never will it forget that it must now share its authority in Germany with us.
What astounded contemporaries about Frederick's Silesian adventure was the formidable performance of the Prussian army. All of Europe marveled at the coordinated movement of its infantry, advancing like moving walls, relentless, unstoppable, an awesome weapon fashioned by Frederick's father.
Of course, this is the inheritance of the soldier's king. This is one of the qualities Frederick inherited from his father. Frederick William I preferred long, tall soldiers who had to be trained in single movements, like one battalion as a single man, moving like walls. The underlying principle was keeping the soldiers in line, which may sound somewhat trivial, but assembling a whole army of 30,000, 40,000 soldiers is only possible if each single man would do what was required.
During his Silesian campaigns, Frederick began to turn Prussia into a highly militarized state. To his men, Fritz, as they affectionately called him, was a fearless comrade who led from the front, dressed in this plain blue uniform.
Doing
about as close as we're going to get to the real Frederick. And there's something touching about the sense of proximity you get when you're confronted with an object so intimately associated with the person of this king. I think it's worth thinking about the effect that this jacket must have had on the king's subjects. And what I think it communicated to them was that the man inside the uniform was in some ways less important than the uniform itself. And this is where I think it becomes really psychologically interesting. It's an act of self-effacement. It's a refusal to be recognized as an individual. And I think that the roots of that self-effacement lie very deep in this king's character. The fact that he grew up in an environment where he was absolutely forbidden to be what he wanted to be. And I think that habit of self-effacement stays with the king throughout his life. And that's one reason why he feels comfortable in this anonymous, symbolic jacket.
In the first 5 years of his 46-year reign, Frederick transformed and enlarged Prussia through war. There now followed over a decade of peace. 11 years in which the king's artistic life blossomed at a beautiful summer palace that came to embody Frederick's cultural world.
When Frederick the Great took over the throne in 1740, he had the problem that in Potsdam there was only the city palace and there was no garden. And it was so fashionable in the mid-18th century to have a garden to the palace, so that he was looking for a garden spot somewhere, and he found this little mountain, he bought it. And if you have a garden, you know you need a garden house somehow. And this is, if you like, the beginning of Sanssouci. It has only 12 rooms, so it is a little garden house.
The Palace of Sanssouci, French for without a care, was an extraordinary cultural statement. Here was a Prussian king whose palace was more French orangerie than German castle, and whose inner circle looked to France for its intellectual inspiration.
He invited friends. There were several philosophers and so on, most famous Voltaire, for example, who lived here for 3 years. And they would come here for the day and then have discussion circles or dinners and so on. His idea of this place was to live between the real world and the world he was dreaming of, I think.
Away from the bustle of the royal court in Berlin, Sanssouci was Frederick's spiritual home. And it was in the music room here that he won a reputation as a prolific composer and gifted musician.
He probably could be considered one of the most competent amateur flute players there ever was. All the composers at the court during his lifetime wrote flute pieces, and some of them were immensely difficult. The ones he wrote for himself also contain quite difficult passages. Even now, a flute player who could play all those materials with ease would be a highly accomplished flute player.
So he's a highly accomplished player, but why does he choose the flute?
There are a number of reasons. Firstly, the flute has a long-standing association with military practice. At the same time, it was an instrument you could play with elegance and ease. You would not find a king playing the trumpet, for example, or the violin. The violin involved too much contortion of the body. Secondly, the flute had been developed from the simpler cylindrical instrument of the Renaissance into this three-piece, highly ornamented instrument of the early 18th century by French makers and players. And it was the French players who gave the flute a sort of élan that it hadn't had before.
The highly acculturated milieu of Sanssouci would become a recurrent theme in representations of Frederick long after his death. But one person who didn't enjoy the pleasures of the king's summer palace was his wife.
Frederick was married to Elisabeth Christine from Braunschweig-Bevern, and she was not living here. In Sanssouci there was no space for her. She was only once visiting this place, and she saw there's no space for me, and she left again. There was not really love between Frederick and Christine. They had no children. She had her duties, he had his, and that was it.
The king did not divorce his wife, banish her from the country, or replace her with mistresses. But he became notorious for the remarkable lack of feeling he displayed towards her, leading contemporaries and historians alike to speculate about Frederick's sexuality.
It's nowadays often asked whether Frederick the Great was gay or not, and it's a delicate question because gayness in the 18th century means something well, of course it means the same thing as nowadays, but it has a different importance, mainly in this social level, because at the court it would be interesting if someone else is from the same social level, but not really if he is from this sex or the other sex. So Frederick, he had partners, les favoris, he had men, but he had to press his feelings under the carpet. And so I think in the psychology of this king, of this man, it is a very important aspect to him.
Even in his most private domain, the most powerful man in the land was, once more, the mirror that dared not be what nature made it. Perhaps the closest expression of his true self we can hope to find is in his music.
For me, it's a music with sufficient profundity to say that he was somebody who wrote from a true necessity to make music. It wasn't just a pose. The predominant affect is melancholy. There are moments almost of a sort of choleric agitation. Anger, sadness, passion, as if he's overtaken by a moment of passion. There's a sense that it was for him a genuine and truthful expression.
It was 11 years since Frederick had been to war. But in January 1756, the king made a rare strategic blunder. He was maneuvered into an ill-judged alliance with the British that alienated Prussia's powerful neighbors and plunged his kingdom into crisis.
This was a diplomatic disaster. Prussia was now encircled by a mighty coalition comprising France, Austria, and Russia. Frederick faced the prospect of a war on three fronts, a war that could threaten Prussia's very existence.
Frederick's reaction was characteristically decisive and typically do or die. He packed his flute, saddled up his horse, and once again prepared his army to strike first. In August, Frederick invaded Saxony, the most powerful of Prussia's rival German states. Taking Saxony would reduce the threat of an attack on Berlin. But this was a high-risk move. Frederick's Prussia was plunged into its longest and bloodiest war. The king would spend the next 7 years on horseback, riding thousands of miles, commanding his armies, and micromanaging his kingdom from the saddle. Lose, and Prussia could be returned to its primordial condition as a landlocked German backwater.
At 8 o'clock in the morning, on the 5th of November 1757, Frederick stood in this very spot on the morning of a great battle. And across these fields stood 40,000 French and Austrian troops. The Prussian army was outnumbered 2 to 1. Things had not been going well for the Prussians thus far, but the Battle of Rossbach would prove a crucial turning point in the king's fortunes.
In previous campaigns, there had been little hint of Frederick's individual genius on the battlefield.
Oh, this is incredible.
But in what would become known as the 7 Years' War, Fritz would prove to be Prussia's most potent weapon.
Dieses Diorama ist ja das Diorama der Schlacht bei Rossbach. Die hat stattgefunden am 5. November 1757.
Okay, so this is the diorama of the Battle of Rossbach, fought on the 5th of November 1757.
Nobody knows the Battle of Rossbach more intimately than Herr Wenzel.
Das liegt ganz da hinten in der Ecke. Das ist Rossbach und Mücheln.
So, after a briefing from the master, let's see if I can explain.
So the French marched in a great arc behind these hills and emerged into this space here. You can see the French troops just here pushing forward. And when Frederick saw that the French troops were trying to outflank his position, he used one of the oldest tricks in the book. He faked a retreat. The French fell for this trick, hook, line and sinker, and went into pursuit mode. At this point, out of sight from the French positions, the Prussians started bombarding the front of the French lines, the French cavalry. And in that moment, wie viel waren das?
3,200.
3,300 Prussian cavalrymen pushed in and made its first attack. At this point, two very bad things happened to the French. The first is that their forwards marching infantry columns are subjected to artillery fire. That's bad enough. But at that moment, the marching columns of Prussian infantry closed like the blades of a scissors, cutting into the flanks of the French. And this is really Frederick's doing.
Prussia's enemy was a coalition force of mixed nationalities, its commanders speaking different languages, its troops' loyalties divided. But Frederick boasted a tightly organized, highly motivated, beautifully drilled army, united behind a single, inspirational leader.
Rossbach was Frederick's most important military victory. The French columns were broken up and destroyed. The day was decided in a matter of minutes. The Prussians lost 500 men, the enemy lost 10,000. And most important of all, it's at Rossbach that Frederick emerged as a truly brilliant military commander.
After his victory at Rossbach, Frederick rode over 200 miles east to face the Austrians at Leuthen in Silesia. Once again, outnumbered by almost 2 to 1, the Prussians won a famous victory. Leuthen would become the most celebrated battle of Frederick's life, a triumph that would seal his place in history as a military genius, on a par with Caesar and Napoleon.
As the Prussians marched from the battlefield at Leuthen, legend has it that a single soldier began to sing. He was immediately joined by the entire host in a spontaneous rendition of a famous hymn of thanksgiving, known thereafter and to this very day as the Chorale of Leuthen.
Napoleon later claimed that Frederick's achievement at the Battle of Leuthen alone placed him among the greatest commanders of all time. Nearly 2 centuries after the event, the famous victory was dramatically reenacted in a Nazi propaganda film.
Long after his death, Frederick's epic victories would become the stuff of legend.
But a grueling war on 3 fronts stretched Prussia to its very limit, and not even Frederick the Great was infallible. In August 1759, Frederick arrived here in Kunersdorf to face his greatest fear, the massive Russian army, which had made it to within just 90 kilometers of Berlin. Initially, Frederick's men overwhelmed the enemy, But the king then made a critical mistake.
The Prussian king, who decided that we continue our attack, he saw only the relative flat land. There is a very deep valley, very deep depression.
This is the famous Kuhgrund.
Kuhgrund. That is in this direction about 1 kilometer. You have to go down and climb up, but they have to order their lines before next attack. And this ordering under continuous Russian fire was destructive for the army. The attack was stopped because there was no army anymore, only a group of
fleeing soldiers.
Flying soldiers, yes.
Kunersdorf was a disaster. 19,000 Prussian casualties, 6,000 of them dead on the field, and most of the Prussians who were killed just here in the Kuhgrund as they made their way towards
failed to capitalize. Frederick held out, and Prussia fought on for another 5 years, its resilience personified by a notorious class of loyal warriors.
In order to understand the success of Frederick's military machine, we need to understand the ethos and culture of the noble class who ran it, the Prussian Junkers.
In Frederick's view, the Junkers, Prussia's conservative landowning nobility, were the only group capable of serving as officers in the military. As such, they enjoyed a unique relationship with the Prussian state.
Hello, please come in.
And the Kleists are one of the oldest of these Prussian noble families.
It's sometimes said that the officer class and the Prussian nobility are essentially the same thing. Is that true?
It is true that under Frederick the Great, in those days, you know, most of the higher-ranking officers were noblemen. Only the eldest son inherits the estate, and the younger sons have to go. So they served as civil servants or officers, and created a so-called Dienstadel.
A service nobility.
Service nobility, and it was a question of honor to serve le roi de Prusse.
And of course the king had this view that only the nobility had a true honor code, and therefore only the nobility was fitted for service in an officer role.
That was the idea of Frederick's father. He invented, so to speak, a code of honor, and the young Frederick the Great was very intelligent, you know, to use it. It all belongs to the militarization of the whole country. Frederick the Great concentrated the whole country on his military ideas. And I feel that it is not only the Frederick times, but in general Prussian feeling, you know, we do something for our fatherland.
During Frederick's military campaigns, 1,500 officers died, a toll concentrated on a small group of noble families. This collective loss of its young men earned the Junkers a powerful and permanent bond with the state. Their values became a defining feature of successive Prussian regimes in war and in peace.
Of course, this nobility internalized military service as a way of life, according a high esteem to military virtues such as courage, loyalty, discipline. But it's important to remember that militarism and bellicosity, militarism and warmongering are not the same thing. Prussia was not a warmongering state during the reign of Frederick the Great. In fact, it spent less time at war than any of the other major European powers.
Loyalty alone wasn't enough to win the 7 Years' War, but the patriotic resilience of his army did buy Frederick just enough time to prevail. Ultimately, he was saved by a stroke of luck. In 1762, with Prussia's forces all but spent, Tsarina Elizabeth, ruler of Russia, died. Her passing was celebrated in Berlin as the miracle of Brandenburg. Her successor, Grand Duke Peter, was an ardent admirer of Frederick. Russia's days in the anti-Prussian coalition were numbered. The 7 Years' War would soon be over, and its end inaugurated 23 years of peaceful Frederiциan rule. In the second half of his reign, diplomacy, realpolitik, and the first partition of Poland would bring Frederick more new territory than he'd gained through war. At home, he worked tirelessly to build the progressive state he had outlined in the Anti-Machiavel, a vision that survives today in the architecture at the very center of Berlin.
Frederick had initially intended that this square should be your bog-standard European residential square. That meant at one end there'd be a palace, and then extending from each wing a royal opera house and a royal library. But what Frederick did was something completely radical. He subtracted the palace from this ensemble, and instead you had an opera on one side, a freestanding library opposite, and over in the corner, St. Hedwig's Cathedral. Work on this cathedral began in 1745 after the king got back from the Silesian Wars, and St. Hedwig was the patron saint of Silesia. This was to be a cathedral for the Catholic subjects of a Protestant kingdom. It was one thing to tolerate the existence of a religious minority within the borders of your kingdom. That was not uncommon in 18th century Europe. But to establish a building like this as a projection of tolerance, as a value in its own right, that was a highly distinctive and unusual gesture.
In characteristic absolutist fashion, the king intervened personally in every area of state policy: public education, the civil service, law, agriculture, trade and industry.
Und war ein absoluter Herrscher, das auf alle Fälle. Aber war natürlich genauso aufgeklärt. Und ich denke, gerade Friedrich II. Zeigt, dass beides tatsächlich auch zu machen geht. Zum Beispiel hat die Folter abgeschafft. Hat für religiöse Toleranz propagiert. Hat ja auch in gewisser Weise die Zensur in Preußen abgeschafft. Und hat tatsächlich reformerische Ideen angeregt und dann auch umgesetzt. Das größte und beste Beispiel ist garantiert die Justizreform.
Conceived during his last years and published in 1794, 8 years after his death, this is perhaps Frederick's greatest domestic achievement: a comprehensive law code which redefined the relationship between the monarchy and the state.
The law code envisaged a world of free citizens in which the state was sovereign and kings and governments were bound by law. Almost 20,000 paragraphs legislate for every conceivable transaction between one Prussian and another. Before there was a general law code, the law was embodied in an endless plethora of edicts and decrees. With the law code, suddenly you had transparency, you had Glasnost.
Frederick's achievements made him a cult figure throughout Europe, but the king himself shunned personal adulation. In his last 20 years, he withdrew almost entirely from his capital, a cranky old man most likely to be glimpsed walking his beloved greyhounds at Sanssouci.
With the exception of a few coins and medallions, this is the only image which Frederick of Prussia deliberately propagated of himself. And it's a portrait by Johann Heinrich Christoph Franke. The king shown here is not a glorious or powerful figure. He's effectively an old man. We see a tired old man. He turns towards us, a face bearing all the marks of age. Cheeks are sunken, the lips have fallen, he's clearly lost all his teeth. And it really is remarkable that it's by this image that this king wanted to be remembered. What it really is a fascinating document, which I think captures the king's sense of who he himself was. He perceived himself, I think, as a man whose energies had been consumed by long years of war and long years of work for his subjects, for his kingdom, for the Prussian state.
Frederick the Great died, aged 74, in his armchair on 17th of August, 1786. He had built a progressive, cultured, and militarized state. There was no Enigma.
We're surrounded by what are often called the arts of peace, and it might seem impossible to imagine that the man who led his armies is also the man who designed and financed this extraordinary palace of Sanssouci. Is this a paradox? I don't think so. It certainly was not a paradox for Frederick. For Frederick, it was all part of the sort of Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art that was his life. He was an intensely aesthetic man who thought through everything that he did in an aesthetic as well as a political and philosophical way. This cultivation of the arts, of music, of conversation, of philosophy, and of reasoned, rational statecraft, they were all cut from one cloth. There was no paradox here between the Frederick who played the flute and the Frederick who led armies. These two worlds flow together in Frederick's existence and become one. The contradiction is dissolved. Most young Germans know next to nothing of Frederick the Great. Even here in Berlin, where the echoes of his memory are everywhere.
You don't have to look too hard to find Frederick's presence in the German capital today. But among the people, he's a distant, largely forgotten figure. The memory of his deeds buried by the sheer scale and weight of Germany's subsequent triumphs and traumas. In the late 19th century, Prussia rose under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck to become the political heartland of a single German nation. A Hohenzollern descendant of Frederick's family, Kaiser Wilhelm II, led this unified Germany into the horrors of World War I. But it was in the 1930s that Frederick the Great's Prussia would be most emphatically appropriated as a model for the future of Germany.
It's difficult to imagine today, but this was once the site of Potsdam's garrison church. Built in 1735 by Frederick's father, Frederick William I, the so-called Soldier King, it was an eloquent statement of Prussia's military identity.
In March 1933, this was the setting for a dramatic propaganda spectacle known as the Day of Potsdam. As Adolf Hitler proclaimed the inauguration of the Third Reich, wreaths were laid on the tombs of Frederick and his father, and the church resounded to the familiar strains of the Leuten Chorale.
The purpose of the Day of Potsdam was to anchor the Hitler regime in Prussian history. It proclaimed the fusion of the old Prussia and the new Germany.
In the same year as the Day of Potsdam, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, began to take control of the German film studio UFA. Goebbels would raise the Nazification of Frederick's Prussia to a fine art.
Und kommen muss ein deutsches Reich, und Preußen muss es führen.
For German cinema goers in the 1930s, Otto Gebühr was Frederick the Great. And in films such as Der große König, the Great King, Goebbels turned his Frederick into a prototype for Hitler.
Habsburg hat sich als unfähig erwiesen für eine solche Führung, da es bereit ist, seine Macht über Deutschland mit fremden Völkern zu teilen, denen das Wohl der Deutschen gar nicht am Herzen liegen kann.
What do you think these depictions tell us about Hitler's attitude to Frederick the Great?
First of all, it's so directly to parallel Frederick with Hitler. This only man, this single man, einsam, alone,
solitary,
having the responsibility for all these things, this single man deciding everything. That's a thing which fits to Hitler. Hitler himself always tried to find parallels in some mystic way that the fate which was with Frederick will also be with him.
Das Schlimmste ist der Krieg. Wer hat ihn gewollt? Ich nicht. Mein Vater auch nicht. Du vielleicht?
One thing that's very remarkable about this film is that various characters make reproaches to the king, which are the kinds of complaints and reproaches that many Germans were tempted to make of Hitler. They say, you've dragged us into a war needlessly, you've sacrificed the welfare of the people.
Yeah, you spoil everything, you kill the people.
Das ganze Land liegt voll von Leichen. Jedes Dorf, jedes Haus, jeder Stall.
I think this is a very intelligent way of doing propaganda. And the idea is, okay, if we, the system which shows you this movie, already knows about it, all these questions, we know the answers to, we know what you think, it gives them Glaubwürdigkeit.
It gives them credibility.
Credibility. Frederick the Great won the war, and so maybe Hitler might also, so don't be afraid that we have too many enemies.
To equate Hitler with Frederick the Great, Nazi Germany with Prussia, is a ludicrous perversion of history. The idea that one of Europe's most enlightened and gifted monarchs prefigured one of the most repellent dictators in modern history is simply absurd. But during the final stages of World War II, as his downfall became inevitable, Hitler's identification with the Prussian king steadily intensified.
The Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, had a very, very big influence. Goebbels used to read the personal papers and the letters of Frederick the Great, so he could say to Hitler, oh, it's exactly your situation. And he reacted exactly like you. And he gave an imagination that Hitler should think, oh, I'm very near to Frederick, and if I'm very near, I will win the war, maybe.
In the 7 Years' War, Frederick had been saved by the death of the Russian Tsarina, the miracle of Brandenburg. And in April 1945, it seemed that history was repeating itself.
Aboard a special train beginning the 24-hour trip back to Washington, the 31st President of the United States leaves Warm Springs forever.
So tight was the grip of this historical romance that the propaganda minister responded with elation and even a sense of triumph when he learned the news of the death of the American President Franklin Roosevelt on the 12th of April 1945. And he put a call through to Hitler's apartment and said, "Mein Führer, I congratulate you. Roosevelt is dead. God has not abandoned us."
But this was pure fantasy. Within a month of Roosevelt's death, Berlin was finally overrun by the Russians. Germany was defeated. Too important to lie forgotten for long. And 30 years ago, he was back in Berlin.
In 1980, the communist government of East Germany relocated this equestrian statue of Frederick the Great to its original position here on Unter den Linden, in the heart of what was then East Berlin, the capital of the German Democratic Republic. The statue had been removed from the center of Berlin around the time that the Berlin Wall went up in 1961. At that time, Frederick was an unwelcome reminder of Germany's reactionary past. But by 1980, things had changed, and the communists did a curious U-turn. They reclaimed the King of Prussia as a socialist hero. He was recast as a king of the beggars, a monarch with a social conscience.
Successive German regimes have found the urge to reinvent this man in their own image irresistible. They warped and distorted his memory. But as we emerge from the shadows of the 20th century, Frederick remains a man too great to ignore.
It's Frederick's brilliance and complexity that put him among the great leaders of history. Figures such as Caesar and Napoleon, who, whatever we may choose to make of them, so captured the spirit of their age that it is impossible to imagine the past without them.